Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. This is Marty Kaiser with another episode of Real Estate Tidbits. Hope everyone is doing well. We have great weather. Hopefully the rain will stay away for the next few days. As I mentioned yesterday, we were doing something a little different. We're having back-to-back podcasts to make up for my absence due to health reasons last week. So yesterday's podcast we posted yesterday, and today's podcast we're posting as soon as I finish this. So hopefully you'll listen to both of them and feel that they have a good blend. This one's going to kind of piggyback to where yesterday's left off to have a little bit more continuity with it. So a couple of things of interest that have happened since yesterday, which I was very pleased with. I actually had a few questions that came up from some of my listeners due to some topics that I raised on yesterday's podcast, because yesterday's podcast, besides having real estate, had some non-real estate issues that I was trying to tie together with societal issues and how that impacts real estate and vice versa. And the issues yesterday dealt with some sports topics. One was Caitlin Clark, and the other one was just the Tyreek Hill situation with the police. So the questions that I had from yesterday's podcast actually both dealt with Caitlin Clark. And it was interesting, there was two conflicting perspectives in the questions. So I'll give you the questions first, excuse me, and then I'll tell you how I answered the questions. The first question was that they thought I was giving inferences on the Caitlin Clark perspective in terms of, I said that I didn't feel she was being fairly treated, but that I didn't really give specificity as to the underlying issues. And so I try to keep this show informative, somewhat opinionated, but I've tried up to this point to stay away from more controversy. But I will shed light a little bit on my insights into her situation in relation to this question that I received. So why do I think that Caitlin Clark has experienced a lot of what I consider to be unusual treatment from her fellow players, and how the media is divided? The prominent media people that are male tend to, for the most part, be very supportive of Caitlin Clark and feel that it's not only illogical, but it's really going to hurt the WNBA or the Female Basketball League. And then the female commentators that are primarily ex-players, either in the WNBA or possibly had coached, and they've taken a different perspective, basically defending the players' actions against Caitlin Clark. So obviously, those are two different perspectives quite a bit. And that kind of correlates to our society, because you have two people that look at the debate the other night between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and one group thinks that Kamala Harris just beat Donald Trump's brains in, and another group felt that Donald Trump did very well, and that and that Kamala Harris didn't provide enough information about her personal views. And I watched the debates also. I'm not going to give an opinion on the debate on this podcast, but obviously I watched the debate too. And to me, when I hear these two different perspectives, I just kind of scratched my head and said, well, what debate was each party watching? But to get back to the Caitlin Clark situation, and why I feel this is more noteworthy and should be discussed more, unfortunately, I'm a middle-aged male. I think I have a pretty open mind about things. I try to be more fact-based in my opinions. I try to keep emotion out of it. That's how I've always conducted my real estate business. I try to look out for the interest of my customers, and I give them my opinions, market recommendations, and the pros and cons of their property based on my experience, knowledge, and last but not least, the facts. So let's get back to Caitlin Clark's situation for a second. As I mentioned, she's been highly dissed, for lack of a better term, by a lot of the ex-players and such. So I've carefully listened to all the commentary, and I've watched, the basketball games, and I've seen how Caitlin Clark's behaved both when she was in college at the University of Iowa and also during her time in the WNBA this season. And the only things that I've come up with are a couple things. Number one, there's a lot of jealousy against Caitlin Clark. And to me, jealousy is a terrible sentiment to have, regardless of what industry or personal relationship you're in. Jealousy and envy are just negative feelings and just do nothing positive. But let's go below the surface. Why are they feeling this way, and why is it such a negative way to feel? Well, I feel it's for a few reasons. I would say 3 potential reasons. I'm not going to weight them, but I'm going to give you 3 reasons. Some of which is these players played a while ago and played long and hard, didn't make a lot of income, as I mentioned yesterday, and are jealous and envious that Caitlin Clark is going to have more opportunities. Well, that's just the evolution of the sport. In my opinion, it's just like I'll use basketball, for example. Some of the top players in the NBA are going to make $40, $50, $60 million a year, where players that played 30 and 40 years ago, for example, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, when they got record contracts in those days, they made $1 million or $2 million a year. And you could argue that Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and then Michael Jordan basically saved the NBA and made it more popular. So they're making $1 or $2 million a year in the 80s, and then these players today that are the premier players in the league are making 40, 50, and up to $60 million. So you can say that they were shortchanged, but you never hear any of those players come out and criticize the younger players for making that money. It's just all about timing. It's just like in real estate. If you bought a house in 2005 in the Orlando market, and I'm just using a hypothetical, I sold a house in 2005, for example, in Hunters Creek for $650,000, which was a mega profit for that particular seller back in 2005. We went through a significant market correction with short sales and foreclosures and the like between 2009 and 2011, where our real estate market really tanked. And that same house came on the market as a foreclosure and sold in 2010, as I recall, for $325,000. So it lost half its value in 4 to 5 year period. So the person that ultimately lost that house not only paid $650,000 for it, put down a down payment, if I recall, of at least 20%. So they lost $130,000, which is a lot of money for the average person. And then the house went back to the bank. That was a timing issue, number one, and you could say maybe there wasn't a clear evaluation of the market in 2005 and 6 by some of the buyers during those periods of time. If that house were to sell today in 2024, which is approximately 13 or 14 years after it sold for $325, it would probably sell for $750,000 to $800,000. So we have a timeline of $650,000 in 2005, $325,000 in 2010, and 800 plus in 2024. So that's quite a deviation. And obviously some people benefited tremendously and other people lost a lot of money. But you can't blame that on the seller. The seller took advantage of the market conditions and optimized their investment. By the same token, the buyer that's going to pay 800 plus for it in 2024, that's what the market is bearing. Now, the main difference between 2024 and 2005, in my opinion, that I've been in the real estate business for a long time, is that we're in a much more solid market today. People that are buying houses are much better qualified. There's not as much creative financing to unqualified people. So even if the market flattens out at some point, the people that are buying now are not going to be in financial peril. Now, to parallel that back to basketball salaries and specifically the jealousy that Caitlin Clark experiences, as I mentioned, I feel that's due to three things. Number one, the players back in the day in the WNBA just didn't have that opportunity. So as I mentioned when I correlated that to the NBA, that's just bad timing. You can mull on that and cry about how unfair that is, or you can say that had nothing to do with anybody. It just was a timing factor, and right now the WNBA is on a big high. The number two reason and the number three reason are things that are more sensitive topics to bring up and much more controversial. And this is just my opinion. I feel one of the sensitive topics, unfortunately, could be a racial topic. And what do I mean by that? Well, Caitlin Clark is a white player that played in the Corn Belt in Iowa. Most of the criticism that she's been receiving from ex-WNBA players are black African-American players. And I think they feel that a lot of the notoriety and opportunities she's getting are because she's white. And I think that, unfortunately, I can't prove or disprove that their feelings don't have some merit, because that's an opinion. However, I do feel that's an unfortunate way to look at things. It's certainly not going to improve race relations every time somebody of a different race experiences something good or bad and credit it to what's taking place because of their race. I personally feel that it might be a slight contributor, but I think the main thing is the timing. I think that people really appreciate her skill set. She does things that haven't been done in women's basketball for the most part. And she's an extremely eloquent and well-behaved spokesperson. She never criticizes anybody. She never makes excuses when she has a bad game. She doesn't look down on people that came before her. She's been very gracious in her behavior. And she's also experienced some very physical play in the league that borders on really dirty play. And, rookies always get a certain amount of additional physicality, but some of the plays that she's experienced are just totally uncalled for. And in my opinion, more punitive action should have gone against the players that were really knocking her around. Again, you can put your own spin on why she was getting that physical play, but it happened and it was on TV, so you can't argue that it didn't happen. The other reason, and this is again more of a sensitive topic, and it's being said quietly, is that she comes across let's say, more demure, more of kind of the mainstream in terms of, what people's expectations are about society versus she's not a large, when I say large, I mean height and muscle bound, and has a certain style to her that's different. Both styles are fine, in my opinion. It shouldn't matter what your body prototype is or anything of that nature. But I feel that does have some semblance of why she's experiencing these things. In either event, whether these opinions are merited or not, at the end of the day, we're talking about negative things that shouldn't be happening. This should be a positive event that everybody should embrace. For example, we just had the Olympics recently, and we had a few of the Americans did exceedingly well. We had Simone Biles in gymnastics who did phenomenally. We had the young lady swimmer who set a record for medals. I think she was number 2 to the male swimmer who had competed for a number of Olympics. And I think she's from Florida originally. And everybody was obviously very proud of her, patriotic. Both of those athletes conducted themselves in an exemplary manner. And everybody felt good about that. And that's theoretically how you would like to acknowledge accomplishments rather than doing that in a negative fashion. So these are just some things that I point out because we need to get past this stuff in society. And just like I mentioned yesterday, in real estate, when it's timing issues, it's easy to put blame on people instead of taking accountability for yourself. Somebody that paid $650,000 for the house that I referenced in 2005, part of that was bad luck, certainly. Part of that, I think, was people just felt that money was just going to flow indefinitely in real estate, meaning that whatever you purchased was going to gain in value exponentially, which it had done for a couple-year period in the late 2004 to late 2006. But that's not reality. If you were a student of real estate history and look at cyclical changes, that's not normal. For example, in Orlando, for the most part, from the 1990s to 2004, in a typical middle-class neighborhood that had its pluses and minuses, was an average-priced home. Prices were appreciating at 2 to 4% a year. And that was very normal, and that was kind of the expectation. So what does that mean? So let's say you bought a $300,000 house in 1995. A 3% increase on that house would be $9,000 a year. So if you compound that over a 10-year period, let's say getting to 2005, using a 3% factor based on a $300,000 purchase price, you would probably have a value, I'm not doing this with a calculator or anything, just in my head, probably around $420,000 in 2005, give or take. So somebody that paid $300,000 and held on to the house for 10 years, when they went to sell it, they'd have a 6-figure profit. So that's kind of forced savings and helping people build financial wealth. And certainly that's everybody's objective in America. But the same example I gave, if somebody had paid that price in 1995 and then they sold their house for $650,000, as I mentioned, in 2005, that's a way different level of appreciation. And when you do the math on that over the 10-year period, that's about an 8% increase a year versus the normal 2 to 4% increase a year. But obviously, I'm averaging the 8% over the 10 years, but the bulk of that profit took place over the 2 years. So that tells me if I'm studying this and I have an excellent real estate agent who's properly educating me, they're going to explain this information to me. So I'm going into the purchase with an understanding and open eyes of what my expectations should be for the next several years. The second thing that occurred during that time frame, and I remember this transaction exactly because I was the listing agent that sold it for $650,000 to a buyer who was somebody else's buyer. When I met the buyer at closing, very nice gentleman, and I chatted with him a little bit, two things were noticeable to me. Number one, he was in an occupation and an income bracket that flat out couldn't afford the $650,000 purchase. He qualified for it in some creative fashion because a lot of the lenders were not conducting themselves in a consumer benefited fashion in 2005 and 6. At the same time, when I spoke with him a little bit more in depth, just making kind of general conversation, he didn't have the knowledge and background of the real estate market and what he was purchasing. And when I left closing and came home that night and had a conversation with my wife, who's also in real estate, I said to her, an interesting thing happened today at the office. And she said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I sold a house for $650,000 that probably a year plus ago would have sold for about $400,000. Didn't have any exceedingly unusual improvements or anything. The buyer that bought the house, I could tell, was an occupation that really wasn't generating adequate income to pay a $650,000 house with a mortgage. And lastly, that this particular customer didn't have the knowledge, expertise, and he wasn't properly educated on what he should expect in the coming years in real estate. And I said to my wife, I felt great for my seller because my job's to get my seller the highest and best price for them. But I felt bad because I knew that this buyer made a bad purchasing decision and that ultimately they were going to probably lose the house. And unfortunately, my feelings were right. This particular owner lost the house 5 years later. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, so he put up probably $130,000 and lost it all, plus whatever else he put into the house and his monthly payments, etc. So this is an example of timing and education and not being envious, because again, when you see your neighbor that maybe has got a fancy car, maybe owns a vacation home, and then you as a neighbor are envious of that possibly and try to do things financially that don't make sense for either your personality, your job situation, or your overall financial situation, that's where jealousy and envy kicks in. And, I've always tried to educate my kids not only on being financially responsible and understanding these market dynamics and components, but not worrying about what your friend or neighbor has. If my friend's a multimillionaire, hey, that's great. I'll give him praise and congratulate him. But that has nothing to do with how I'm living. It's not going to affect what I buy or don't buy. I'm not going to be jealous of that person. I'm going to give them good wishes that they've had good fortune in their life, assuming they came about the money legally. But it makes no difference to me. And I run into the same thing in real estate all the time. I'll give you a quick example. A lot of real estate agents drive fancy cars. that was one of the things that a lot of times you're taught, oh, you got to have a fancy car in real estate because you're going to drive customers around and you've got to impress them that, hey, you're making beaucoup money. So a lot of people have these fancy cars, these high-priced BMWs or Lexus or some of the higher-priced SUVs, Suburbans, whatever the case may be. And then when you talk to many of them, if they're being truthful, they're on leases. They complain about their monthly payment. And then when you look at these agents' productions, to be gracious about it, their real estate production is very moderate. So they're really owning a vehicle that they shouldn't own. And what's one thing you can universally say about vehicles? When you're looking at them strictly from a financial sense, they're one of the worst investments you can make because vehicles do not make you money. As soon as you drive a car off a lot, it's worth less than when you bought it. Now, you should be buying vehicles for transportation, number one. Number two, safety. And number three, enjoyment. So if you can afford a fancy car and you enjoy it more power to you. But you shouldn't be buying that fancy car, A, to keep up with your neighbors, or B, to try to impress your real estate customer. What's a great real estate car, for example? You could drive a Honda Accord, maybe a Ford Explorer. Those are all very normal cars. They all are comfortable for your customers if you drive your customers around. They're affordable, and they don't make you go into debt to own a car just to impress somebody. But I don't think that a customer is going to look down upon you because you drive one of those vehicles. You know, maybe in some situations, if you were specializing in high-end properties, like you were an agent in Orlando that maybe only dealt in Isleworth, and all the houses you were selling were seven-figure homes, then maybe some of those customers might judge you somewhat on your vehicle, and so you may need to drive a nicer vehicle, whether you could afford it or not. They used to have a saying in real estate, fake it until you make it, so some people did that. But except for those isolated incidents, there's no need to put yourself in that financial peril. So that's a little bit about my personal philosophy. You may agree with it, you may disagree with it, you may think I'm a jerk for voicing those opinions, but I think people need to give opinions nowadays, but based on facts. And they shouldn't be scared to say something that's not popular on social media if they truly believe in it and they can back it up with facts. However, if they're just making stuff up, and, you know, when you repeat a lie long enough, there's a percentage of people that believe that I look down on those people and don't want anything to do with them. So that's all for today. I hope everybody has an absolute great weekend. Be safe. If you would like to converse with me further, please email me at marty@floridasells.com. I love getting emails, and as you saw from the show this morning, I respond to them if they're, legitimate questions. And I look forward to you telling your friends and family about our podcast. We're on once a week. Typically, we post a new episode every Friday. Have a great day and weekend, and Marty's out.